Although he ruled them with a rod of iron, he made no secret, either officially or privately, of his deep and abiding admiration for their self-sacrificing valour. His very dispatches showed that he regarded his own skill and courage as small indeed when compared with theirs. Like Napoleon's, his congratulatory orders were conspicuous for the absence of all reference to himself. It was always we, not I, and he was among the first to recognize the worth of the rank and file. "One day," says Dr. Maguire, "early in the war, when the 2nd Virginia Regiment marched by, I said to General Johnston, 'If these men will not fight, you have no troops that will.' He expressed the prevalent opinion of the day in his reply, saying, 'I would not give one company of regulars for the whole regiment.' When I returned to Jackson, I had occasion to quote General Johnston's opinion. 'Did he say that?' he asked, 'and of those splendid men?' And then he added, 'The patriot volunteer, fighting for his country and his rights, makes the most reliable soldier upon earth.' And his veterans knew more than that their general believed them to be heroes. They knew that this great, valiant man, beside whom all others, save Lee himself, seemed small and feeble, this mighty captain, who held the hosts of the enemy in the hollow of his hand, was the kindest and the most considerate of human beings. To them he was Old Jack, in the same affectionate sense as he had been Old Jack to his classmates at West Point. They followed him willingly, for they knew that the path he trod was the way to victory. But they loved him as children do their parents, because they were his first thought and his last. In season and out of season he laboured for their welfare. To his transport and commissariat officers he was a hard master. The unfortunate wight who had neglected to bring up supplies, or who ventured to make difficulties, discovered to his cost that his quiet commander could be very terrible. But those officers who did their duty, in whatever branch of the service they might be serving, found that their zeal was more than appreciated. For himself he asked nothing. On behalf of his subordinates he was a constant and persistent suitor. He was not only ready to support the claims to promotion of those who deserved it, but in the case of those who displayed special merit he took the initiative himself, and he was not content with one refusal. His only difference with General Lee, if difference it can be called, was on a question of this nature. The Commander-in-Chief, it appears, soon after the Battle of Fredericksburg, had proposed to appoint officers to the Second Army Corps who had served elsewhere. After some correspondence, Jackson wrote as follows: "My rule has been to recommend such as were, in my opinion, best qualified for filling vacancies. The application of this rule has prevented me from even recommending for the command of my old brigade one of its officers, because I did not regard any of them as competent as another of whose qualifications I had a higher opinion. This rule has led me to recommend Colonel Bradley T. Johnson for the command of Taliaferro's brigade. I desire the interest of the service, and no other interest, to determine who shall be selected to fill the vacancies. Guided by this principle, I cannot go outside of my command for persons to fill vacancies in it, unless by so doing a more competent officer is secured. This same principle leads me to oppose having officers who have never served with me, and of whose qualifications I have no knowledge, forced upon me by promoting them to fill vacancies in my command, and advancing them over meritorious officers well qualified for the positions, and of whose qualifications I have had ample opportunities of judging from their having served with me. In my opinion, the interest of the service would be injured if I should quietly consent to see officers with whose qualifications I am not acquainted promoted into my command to fill vacancies, regardless of the merits of my own officers who are well qualified for the positions. The same principle leads me, when selections have to be made outside of my command, to recommend those, if there be such, whose former service with me proved them well qualified for filling the vacancies. This induced me to recommend Captain Chew, who does not belong to this Army Corps, but whose well-earned reputation when with me has not been forgotten." And as he studied the wishes of his officers, working quietly and persistently for their advancement, so he studied the wishes of the private soldiers. It is well known that artillerymen come, after a time, to feel a personal affection for their guns, especially those which they have used in battle. When in camp near Fredericksburg, Jackson was asked to transfer certain field pieces, which had belonged to his old division, to another portion of the command. The men were exasperated, and the demand elicited the following letter. December 3rd, 1862. General R. E. Lee, Commanding Army of Northern Virginia. General, your letter of this date, recommending that I distribute the rifle and Napoleon guns so as to give General D. H. Hill a fair proportion, has been received. I respectfully request, if any such distribution is to be made, that you will direct your Chief of Artillery or some other officer to do it. But I hope that none of the guns which belonged to the Army of the Valley before it became part of the Army of Northern Virginia, after the Battle of Cedar Run, will be taken from it. If since that time any artillery has improperly come into my command, I trust that it will be taken away, and the person in whose possession it may be found punished, if his conduct requires it. So careful was I to prevent an improper distribution of the artillery and other public property captured at Harper's Ferry, that I issued a written order directing my staff officers to turn over to the proper chiefs of staff of the Army of Northern Virginia all captured stores. A copy of the order is herewith enclosed. General D. H. Hill's artillery once existed at the time he was assigned to my command, and it is hoped that the artillery which belonged to the Army of the Valley will not be taken to supply his wants. I am, General, your obedient servant, T. J. Jackson, Lieutenant General. No further correspondence is to be found on the subject, so it may be presumed that the protest was successful. Jackson's relations with the rank and file have already been referred to, and although he was now commander of an army corps and universally acknowledged as one of the foremost generals of the Confederacy, his rise in rank and reputation had brought no increase of dignity. He still treated the humblest privates with the same courtesy that he treated the commander-in-chief. He never repelled their advances, nor refused, if he could, to satisfy their curiosity, and although he seldom went out of his way to speak to them, if any soldier addressed him, especially if he belonged to a regiment recruited from the valley, he seldom omitted to make some inquiry after those he had left at home. Never, it was said, was his tone more gentle or his smile more winning than when he was speaking to some ragged representative of his old brigade. How his heart went out to them may be inferred from the following. Writing to a friend at Richmond, he said, "Though I have been relieved from command in the valley, and may never again be assigned to that important trust, yet I feel deeply when I see the patriotic people of that region under the heel of a hateful military despotism. There are all the hopes of those who have been with me from the commencement of the war in Virginia, who have repeatedly left their homes and families in the hands of the enemy to brave the dangers of battle and disease, and there are those who have so devotedly laboured for the relief of our suffering, sick and wounded." Chapter 22. Winter Quarters, 1863. During the long interval between the Battle of Fredericksburg and the next campaign, Jackson employed himself in preparing the reports of his battles, which had been called for by the Commander-in-Chief. They were not compiled in their entirety by his own hand. He was no novice at literary composition, and his pen, as his letterbook shows, was not that of an unready writer. He had a good command of language, and that power of clear and concise expression which every officer in command of a large force, a position naturally entailing a large amount of confidential correspondence, must necessarily possess. But the task now set him was one of no ordinary magnitude. Since the Battle of Kernstown, the report of which had been furnished in April 1862, the time had been too fully occupied to admit of the crowded events being placed on record, and more than one half of the division, brigade, and regimental commanders who had been engaged in the operations of the period had been killed. Nor, even now, did his duties permit him the necessary leisure to complete the work without assistance. On his requisition, therefore, Colonel Charles Faulkner, who had been United States Minister to France before the war, was attached to his staff for the purpose of collecting the reports of the subordinate commanders and combining them in the proper form. The rough drafts were carefully gone over by the general. Every sentence was weighed, and everything that might possibly convey a wrong impression was at once rejected. Evidence was called to clear up disputed points. No inferences or suppositions were allowed to stand. Truth was never permitted to be sacrificed to effect. Superlatives were rigorously excluded, and the narratives may be unquestionably accepted as an accurate relation of the facts. Many stirring passages were added by the general's own pen, and the praise bestowed upon the troops, both officers and men, is couched in the warmest terms. Yet much was omitted. Jackson had a rooted objection to represent the motives of his actions, or to set forth the object of his movements. In reply to a remonstrance that those who came after him would be embarrassed by the absence of these explanations, and that his fame would suffer, he said, "The men who come after me must act for themselves, and as to the historians who speak of the movements of my command, I do not concern myself greatly as to what they may say." To judge, then, from the reports, Jackson himself had very little to do with his success. Indeed, were they the only evidence available, it would be difficult to ascertain whether the more brilliant manoeuvres were ordered by himself or executed on the initiative of others. But in this he was perfectly consistent. When the publisher of an illustrated periodical wrote to him, asking him for his portrait and some notes of his battles as the basis of a sketch, he replied that he had no likeness of himself and had done nothing worthy of mention. It is not without interest in this connection to note that the Old Testament supplied him with a pattern for his reports, just as it supplied him, as he often declared, with precepts and principles applicable to every military emergency. After he was wounded, enlarging one morning on his favourite topic of practical religion, he turned to the staff officer in attendance, Lieutenant Smith, and asked him with a smile, "Can you tell me where the Bible gives generals a model for their official reports of battles?" The aide-de-camp answered, laughing, that it never entered his mind to think of looking for such a thing in the Scriptures. "Nevertheless," said the general, "there are such, and excellent models too. Look, for instance, at the narrative of Joshua's battles with the Amalekites. There you have one. It has clearness, brevity, modesty, and it traces the victory to its right source, the blessing of God." The early spring of 1863 was undoubtedly one of the happiest seasons of a singularly happy life. Jackson's ambition, if the desire for such rank that would enable him to put the powers within him to the best use may be so termed, was fully gratified. The country lad who, 21 years ago, on his way to West Point, had looked on the green hills of Virginia from the Capitol at Washington, could hardly have anticipated a higher destiny than that which had befallen him. Over the hearts and wills of 30,000 magnificent soldiers, the very flower of Southern manhood, his empire was absolute, and such dominion is neither the heritage of princes nor within the reach of wealth. The most trusted lieutenant of his great commander, the strong right arm with which he had executed his most brilliant enterprises, he shared with him the esteem and admiration not only of the army but of the whole people of the South. The name he had determined, in his lonely boyhood, to bring back to honour already ranked with those of the revolutionary heroes. Even his enemies, for the brave men at the front left rancour to the politicians, were not proof against the attraction of his great achievements. A friendly intercourse, not always confined to a trade of coffee for tobacco, existed between the outposts. Johnnies and Yanks often exchanged greetings across the Rappahannock, and it is related that one day when Jackson rode along the river and the Confederate troops ran together, as was their custom, to greet him with a yell, the Federal pickets, roused by the sudden clamour, crowded to the bank and shouted across to ask the cause. "General Stonewall Jackson," was the proud reply of the grey-coated sentry. Immediately, to his astonishment, the cry, "Hurrah for Stonewall Jackson!" rang out from the Federal ranks, and the voices of North and South, prophetic of a time to come, mingled in acclamation of a great American. The situation of the army, although the winter was unusually severe, was not without its compensations. The country was covered with snow, and storms were frequent. Rations were still scarce, for the single line of badly laid rails, subjected to the strain of an abnormal traffic, formed a precarious means of transport. Every spring and pond was frozen, and the soldiers shivered beneath their scanty coverings. Huts, however, were in process of erection, and the goodwill of the people did something to supply the deficiencies of the commissariat. The homes of Virginia were stripped, and many, like Jackson himself, whose blankets had already been sent from Lexington to his old brigade, ordered their carpets to be cut up into rugs and distributed amongst the men. But neither cold nor hunger could crush the spirit of the troops. The bivouacs were never merrier than on the bare hills and in the dark pine woods which looked down on the ruins and the graves of Fredericksburg. Picket duty was light, for the black waters of the great river formed a secure barrier against attack, and if the men's stomachs were empty, they could still feast their eyes on a charming landscape. To the right and left, the wooded range extended towards Fredericksburg on the one hand and Port Royal on the other. In front, the far-stretching level gave full sweep to the eye, and at the foot of its forest-clad bluffs, or by the margin of undulating fields, the Rappahannock flowed calmly to the sea. Old mansions dotted this beautiful land, for beautiful it was in spite of the chill influences of winter, with its fertile meadows, its picturesque woodlands, and its old roads skirted by long lines of shadowy cedars. The headquarters of the Second Army Corps were established at Moss Neck, on the terrace above the Rappahannock, 11 miles below Fredericksburg. After the retreat of the Federals to Falmouth, the Confederate troops had reoccupied their former positions, and every point of passage between Fredericksburg and Port Royal was strongly entrenched and closely watched. At Moss Neck, Jackson was not only within easy reach of his divisions, but was more comfortably housed than had usually been the case. A hunting lodge, which stood on the lawn of an old and picturesque mansion house, the property of a gentleman named Corbin, was placed at his disposal. He had declined the offer of rooms in the house itself, lest he should trespass on the convenience of its inmates, and to show the peculiar constitution of the Confederate Army, an anecdote recorded by his biographers is worth quoting. After his first interview with Mrs. Corbin, he passed out to the gate, where a cavalry orderly who had accompanied him was holding his horse. "Do you approve of your accommodation, General?" asked the courier. "Yes, sir. I have decided to make my quarters here." "I am Mr. Corbin, sir," said the soldier, "and I am very pleased." The lower room of the lodge, hung with trophies of the chase, was both his bedroom and his office, while a large tent, pitched on the grass outside, served as a mess room for his military family. And here, for 3 long months, until near the end of March, he rested from the labour of his campaigns. The Federal troops, stationed on the snow-clad heights across the river, remained idle in their camps, slowly recovering from the effects of their defeat on the fields of Fredericksburg. The pickets had ceased to bicker, the gunboats had disappeared, and all was quiet on the Rappahannock. Many of the senior officers in the Confederate Army took advantage of the lull in operations to visit their homes, but Jackson steadfastly refused to absent himself even for a few days from the front. In November, to his unbounded delight, a daughter had been born to him. "To a man of his extreme domesticity and love for children," says his wife, "this was a crowning happiness, and yet, with his great modesty and shrinking from publicity, he requested that he should not receive the announcement by telegraph, and when it came to him by letter, he kept the glad tidings to himself, leaving his staff and those around him in the camp to hear of it from others. This was to him a joy with which a stranger could not intermeddle, and from which even his own hand could not lift the veil of sanctity. His letters were full of longing to see his little Julia, for by this name, which had been his mother's, he had desired her to be christened, saying, "My mother was mindful of me when I was a helpless, fatherless child, and I wish to commemorate her now. How thankful I am," he wrote, "to our kind Heavenly Father for having spared my precious wife and given us a little daughter. I cannot tell how gratified I am, nor how much I wish I could be with you and see my 2 darlings. But while this pleasure is denied me, I am thankful it is accorded to you to have the little pet, and I hope it may be a great deal of company and comfort to its mother. Now don't exert yourself to write to me, for to know that you were exerting yourself to write would give me more pain than the letter would pleasure, so you must not do it. But you must love your esposo in the meantime. I expect you are just now made up with that baby. Don't you wish your husband wouldn't claim any part of it, but let you have the sole ownership? Don't you regard it as the most precious little creature in the world? Do not spoil it, and don't let anybody tease it. Don't permit it to have a bad temper. How I would love to see the darling little thing. Give her many kisses from her father. At present I am 50 miles from Richmond, and 8 miles from Guineas Station, on the railroad from Richmond to Fredericksburg. Should I remain here, I do hope you and baby can come to see me before spring, as you can come on the railway. Wherever I go, God gives me kind friends. The people here show me great kindness. I receive invitation after invitation to dine out and spend the night, and a great many provisions are sent me, including cakes, tea, loaf sugar, etc., and the socks and gloves and handkerchiefs still come. I am so thankful to our ever-kind Heavenly Father for having so improved my eyes as to enable me to write at night. He continually showers blessings upon me, and that you should have been spared, and our darling little daughter given us, fills my heart with overflowing gratitude. If I know my unworthy self, my desire is to live entirely and unreservedly to God's glory. Pray, my darling, that I may so live. Again to his sister-in-law. I trust God will answer the prayers offered for peace. Not much comfort is to be expected until this cruel war terminates. I haven't seen my wife since last March, and never having seen my child, you can imagine with what interest I look to North Carolina. But the tender promptings of his deep natural affection were stilled by his profound faith that duty is ours, consequences are God's. The Confederate Army, at this time as at all others, suffered terribly from desertion, and one of his own brigades reported 1,200 officers and men absent without leave. Last evening, he wrote to his wife on Christmas Day, I received a letter from Dr. Dabney saying, one of the highest gratifications both Mrs. Dabney and I could enjoy would be another visit from Mrs. Jackson, and he invites me to meet you there. He and Mrs. Dabney are very kind, but it appears to me that it is better for me to remain with my command so long as the war continues. If all our troops, officers and men were at their posts, we might, through God's blessing, expect a more speedy termination of the war. The temporal affairs of some are so deranged as to make a strong plea for their returning home for a short time, but our God has greatly blessed me and mine during my absence, and whilst it would be a great comfort to see you and our darling little daughter, and others in whom I take a special interest, yet duty appears to require me to remain with my command. It is important that those at headquarters set an example by remaining at the post of duty. So business at headquarters went on in its accustomed course. There were inspections to be made, the deficiencies of equipment to be made good, correspondence to be conducted, and the control of 30,000 men demanded much office work, the enemy to be watched, information to be sifted, topographical data to be collected, and the reports of the battles to be written. Every morning, as was his invariable habit during a campaign, the general had an interview with the chiefs of the commissariat, transport, ordnance, and medical departments, and he spent many hours in consultation with his topographical engineer. The great purpose for which Virginia stood in arms was ever present to his mind, and despite his reticence, his staff knew that he was occupied day and night with the problems that the future might unfold. Existence at headquarters to the young and high-spirited officers who formed the military family was not altogether lively. Outside there was abundance of gaiety. The Confederate Army, even on those lonely hills, managed to extract enjoyment from its surroundings. The hospitality of the plantations was open to the officers, and wherever Stuart and his brigadiers pitched their tents, dances and music were the order of the day. Nor were the men behindhand. Even the heavy snow afforded them entertainment. Whenever a thaw took place, they set themselves to making snowballs, and great battles in which one division was arrayed against another, and which were carried through with the pomp and circumstance of war, colours flying, bugles sounding, and long lines charging elaborately planned entrenchments, were a constant source of amusement, except to unpopular officers. Theatrical and musical performances enlivened the tedium of the long evenings, and when by the glare of the campfires the band of the 5th Virginia broke into the rattling quick-step of Dixie's Land, not the least stirring of national anthems, and the great concourse of grey jackets took up the chorus, closing it with a yell that shivered to the tingling stars, the Confederate soldier would not have changed places with the President himself. There was much social intercourse, too, between the different headquarters. General Lee was no unfrequent visitor to Moss Neck, and on Christmas Day Jackson's aides-de-camp provided a sumptuous entertainment, at which turkeys and oysters figured, for the commander-in-chief and the senior generals. Stuart, too, often invaded the quarters of his old comrade, and Jackson looked forward to the merriment that was certain to result just as much as the youngest of his staff. Stuart's exuberant cheerfulness and humour, says Dabney, seemed to be the happy relief, as they were the opposites, to Jackson's serious and diffident temper. While Stuart poured out his quips and cranks, not seldom at Jackson's expense, the latter sat by, sometimes unprepared with any repartee, sometimes blushing, but always enjoying the jest with a quiet and merry laugh. The ornaments on the wall of the general's quarters gave Stuart many a topic of badinage. Affecting to believe that they were of General Jackson's selection, he pointed now to the portrait of some famous racehorse, and now to the print of some celebrated rat terrier, as queer revelations of his private tastes, indicating a great decline in his moral character, which would be a grief and disappointment to the pious old ladies of the South. Jackson, with a quiet smile, replied that perhaps he had had more to do with racehorses than his friends suspected. It was in the midst of such a scene as this that dinner was announced, and the two generals passed to the mess table. It so happened that Jackson had just received, as a present from a patriotic lady, some butter, upon the adornment of which the fair donor had exhausted her housewife's skill. The servants, in honour of General Stuart's presence, had chosen this to grace the centre of the board. As his eye fell upon it, he paused, and with mock gravity pointed to it, saying, "There, gentlemen, if that is not the crowning evidence of our host's sporting tastes. He even has his favourite gamecock stamped on his butter." The dinner, of course, began with great laughter, in which Jackson joined with as much enjoyment as any. Visitors, too, from Europe, attracted by the fame of the army and its leaders, had made their way into the Confederate lines, and were received with all the hospitality that the camps afforded. An English officer has recorded his experiences at Moss Neck. "I brought from Nassau a box of goods, a present from England, for General Stonewall Jackson, and he asked me when I was at Richmond to come to his camp and see him. He left the city one morning about 7 o'clock, and about 10 landed at a station distant some 8 or 9 miles from Jackson's, or, as his men called him, Old Jack's camp. A heavy fall of snow had covered the country for some time before to the depth of a foot, and formed a crust over the Virginian mud, which is quite as villainous as that of Balaclava. The day before had been mild and wet, and my journey was made in a drenching shower, which soon cleared away the white mantle of snow. You cannot imagine the slough of despond I had to pass through. Wet to the skin, I stumbled through mud, I waded through creeks, I passed through pine woods, and at last got into camp about 2 o'clock. I then made my way to a small house occupied by the general as his headquarters. I wrote down my name and gave it to the orderly, and I was immediately told to walk in. The general rose and greeted me warmly. I expected to see an old, untidy man, and was most agreeably surprised and pleased with his appearance. He is tall, handsome, and powerfully built, but thin. He has brown hair and a brown beard. His mouth expresses great determination. The lips are thin and compressed firmly together. His eyes are blue and dark, with keen and searching expression. I was told that his age was 38 and he looks 40. The general, who is indescribably simple and unaffected in all his ways, took off my wet overcoat with his own hands, made up the fire, brought wood for me to put my feet on to keep them warm while my boots were drying, and then began to ask me questions on various subjects. At the dinner hour we went out and joined the members of his staff. At this meal the general said grace in a fervent, quiet manner, which struck me very much. After dinner I returned to his room, and he again talked for a long time. The servant came in and took his mattress out of a cupboard and laid it on the floor. As I rose to retire, the general said, "Captain, there is plenty of room on my bed. I hope you will share it with me." I thanked him very much for his courtesy, but said, "Good night," and slept in a tent, sharing the blankets of one of his aides de camp. In the morning at breakfast time, I noticed that the general said grace before the meal, with the same fervour I had remarked before. An hour or two afterwards, it was time for me to return to the station. On this occasion, however, I had a horse, and I returned to the general's headquarters to bid him adieu. His little room was vacant, so I slipped in and stood before the fire. I then noticed my greatcoat stretched before it on a chair. Shortly afterwards the general entered the room. He said, "Captain, I have been trying to dry your greatcoat, but I am afraid I have not succeeded very well." That little act illustrates the man's character. With the care and responsibilities of a vast army on his shoulders, he finds time to do little acts of kindness and thoughtfulness. With each of his staff officers he was on most friendly terms, and the visitors to his camp, such as the English officer quoted above, found him a most delightful host, discussing with the ease of an educated gentleman all manner of topics, and displaying not the slightest trace of that awkwardness and extreme diffidence which have been attributed to him. The range and accuracy of his information surprised them. "Of military history," said another English soldier, "he knew more than any other man I met in America, and he was so far from displaying the somewhat grim characteristics that have been associated with his name, that one would have thought his tastes lay in the direction of art and literature." His chief delight, wrote the Hon. Francis Lawley, who knew him well, was in the cathedrals of England, notably in York Minster and Westminster Abbey. He was never tired of talking about them or listening to details about the chapels and cloisters of Oxford. "General Jackson," writes Lord Wolseley, "had certainly very little to say about military operations, although he was intensely proud of his soldiers and enthusiastic in his devotion to General Lee, and it was impossible to make him talk of his own achievements, nor can I say that his speech betrayed his intellectual powers. But his manner, which was modesty itself, was most attractive. He put you at your ease at once, listening with marked courtesy and attention to whatever you might say, and when the subject of conversation was congenial, he was a most interesting companion. I quite endorse the statement as to his love for beautiful things. He told me that in all his travels he had seen nothing so beautiful as the lancet windows in York Minster. In his daily intercourse with his staff, however, in his office or in the mess-room, he showed to less advantage than in the society of strangers. His gravity of demeanour seldom wholly disappeared, his intense earnestness was in itself oppressive, and he was often absent and preoccupied. "Life at headquarters," says one of his staff officers, "was decidedly dull. Our meals were often very dreary. The general had no time for light or trivial conversation, and he sometimes felt it his duty to rebuke our thoughtless and perhaps foolish remarks. Nor was it always quite safe to approach him. Sometimes he had a tired look in his eyes, and although he never breathed a word to one or another, we knew that he was dissatisfied with what was being done with the army." Intense concentration of thought and purpose, in itself an indication of a powerful will, had distinguished Jackson from his very boyhood. During his campaigns he would pace for hours outside his tent, his hands clasped behind his back, absorbed in meditation. And when the army was on the march, he would ride for hours without raising his eyes or opening his lips. It was unquestionably at such moments that he was working out his plans, step by step, forecasting the counter-movements of the enemy, and providing for every emergency that might occur. And here the habit of keeping his whole faculties fixed on a single object, and of imprinting on his memory the successive processes of complicated problems, fostered by the methods of study which, both at West Point and Lexington, the weakness of his eyes had made compulsory, must have been an inestimable advantage. Brilliant strategical manoeuvres, it cannot be too often repeated, are not a matter of inspiration and of decision on the spur of the moment. The problems presented by a theatre of war, with their many factors, are not to be solved except by a vigorous and sustained intellectual effort. "If," said Napoleon, "I always appear prepared, it is because, before entering on an undertaking, I have meditated for long and have foreseen what may occur. It is not genius which reveals to me suddenly and secretly what I should do in circumstances unexpected by others. It is thought and meditation." The proper objective, speaking in general terms, of all military operations is the main army of the enemy, for a campaign can never be brought to a successful conclusion until the hostile forces in the field have become demoralized by defeat. But, to ensure success, preponderance of numbers is usually essential, and it may be said, therefore, that the proper objective is the enemy's main army when it is in inferior strength. Under ordinary conditions, the first step, then, towards victory, must be a movement, or a series of movements, which will compel the enemy to divide his forces and put it out of his power to assemble even equal strength on the battlefield. This entails a consideration of the strategic points upon the theatre of war, for it is by occupying or threatening some point which the enemy cannot afford to lose that he will be induced to disperse his army, or to place himself in a position where he can be attacked at a disadvantage. While his main army, therefore, is the ultimate objective, certain strategic points become the initial objectives, to be occupied or threatened either by the main body or detached forces. It is seldom, however, that these initial objectives are readily discovered, and it is very often the case that even the ultimate objective may be obscured. These principles are well illustrated by the operations in the Valley of Virginia during the month of May and the first fortnight of June 1862. After the event, it is easy to see that Banks's army was Jackson's proper objective, being the principal force in the secondary theatre of war. But at the time, before the event, Lee and Jackson alone realized the importance of overwhelming Banks and thus threatening Washington. It was not realized by Johnston, a most able soldier, for the whole of his correspondence goes to show that he thought a purely defensive attitude the best policy for the Valley Army. It was not realized by Jackson's subordinates, for it was not till long after the Battle of Winchester that the real purport of the operations in which they had been engaged began to dawn on them. It was not realized by Lincoln, by Stanton, or even by McClellan, for to each of them the sudden attack on Front Royal was as much of a surprise as to Banks himself, and we may be perfectly confident that none but a trained strategist, after a prolonged study of the map and the situation, would realize it now. It is to be noted, too, that Jackson's initial objectives, the strategical points in the valley, were invariably well selected. The Luray Gap, the single road which gives access across the Massanuttons from one side of the valley to the other, was the most important. The flank position on Elk Run, the occupation of which so suddenly brought up Banks, prevented him interposing between Jackson and Edward Johnson and saved Staunton from capture, was a second. Front Royal, by seizing which he threatened Banks at Strasburg in flank and rear, compelling him to a hasty retreat, and bringing him to battle on ground which he had not prepared, a third. And the position at Port Republic, controlling the only bridge across the Shenandoah and separating Shields from Fremont, a fourth. The bearing of all these localities was overlooked by the Federals, and throughout the campaign we cannot fail to notice a great confusion on their part as regards objectives. They neither recognized what the aim of their enemy would be, nor at what they should aim themselves. It was long before they discovered that Lee's army, and not Richmond, was the vital point of the Confederacy. Not a single attempt was made to seize strategic points, and if we may judge from the orders and dispatches in the official records, their existence was never recognized. To this oversight, the successive defeats of the northern forces were in great part due. From McClellan to Banks, each one of their generals appears to have been blind to the advantages that may be derived from a study of the theatre of war. Not one of them hit upon a line of operations which embarrassed the Confederates, and all possessed the unhappy knack of joining battle on the most unfavourable terms. Moreover, when it at last became clear that the surest means of conquering a country is to defeat its armies, the true objective was but vaguely realized. The annihilation of the enemy's troops seems to have been the last thing dreamt of. Opportunities of crushing him in detail were neither sought for nor created. As General Sheridan said afterwards, "The trouble with the commanders of the Army of the Potomac was that they never marched out to lick anybody. All they thought of was to escape being licked themselves." But it is not sufficient, in planning strategical combinations, to arrive at a correct conclusion as regards the objective. Success demands a most careful calculation of ways and means, of the numbers at disposal, of food, forage, and ammunition, and of the forces to be detached for secondary purposes. The different factors of the problem, the strength and dispositions of the enemy, the roads, railways, fortresses, weather, natural features, the morale of the opposing armies, the character of the opposing general, the facilities for supply, have each and all of them to be considered, their relative prominence assigned to them, and their conflicting claims to be brought into adjustment. For such mental exertion Jackson was well equipped. He had made his own the experience of others. His knowledge of history made him familiar with the principles which had guided Washington and Napoleon in the selection of objectives, and with the means by which they attained them. It is not always easy to determine the benefit, beyond a theoretical acquaintance with the phenomena of the battlefield, to be derived from studying the campaigns of the great masters of war. It is true that no successful general, whatever may have been his practical knowledge, has neglected such study. But while many have borne witness to its efficacy, none have left a record of the manner in which their knowledge of former campaigns influenced their own conduct. In the case of Stonewall Jackson, however, we have much evidence, indirect but unimpeachable, as to the value to a commander of the knowledge thus acquired. The maxims of Napoleon, carried in his haversack, were constantly consulted throughout his campaigns, and this little volume contains a fairly complete exposition, in Napoleon's own words, of the grand principles of war. Moreover, Jackson often quoted principles which are not to be found in the maxims, but on which Napoleon consistently acted. It is clear, therefore, that he had studied the campaigns of the great Corsican in order to discover the principles on which military success is based. That having studied and reflected on those principles, and the effect their application produced in numerous concrete cases, they became so firmly embedded in his mind as to be ever present, guiding him into the right path or warning him against the wrong whenever he had to deal with a strategic or tactical situation. It may be noted, moreover, that these principles, especially those which he was accustomed to quote, were concerned far more with the moral aspect of war than with the material. It is a fair inference, therefore, that it was to the study of human nature as affected by the conditions of war, by discipline, by fear, by the want of food, by want of information, by want of confidence, by the weight of responsibility, by political interests, and, above all, by surprise, that his attention was principally directed. He found in the campaigns of Jena and of Austerlitz not merely a record of marches and manoeuvres, of the use of entrenchments, or of the general rules for attack and defence. This is the mechanical and elementary part of the science of command. What Jackson learned was the truth of the famous maxim that the moral is to the physical, that is, to armament and numbers, as 3 to 1. He learned, too, to put himself into his adversary's place and to realize his weakness. He learned, in a word, that war is a struggle between two intellects rather than the conflict of masses, and it was by reason of this knowledge that he played on the hearts of his enemies with such extraordinary skill. It is not to be asserted, however, that the study of military history is an infallible means of becoming a great or even a good general. The first qualification necessary for a leader of men is a strong character, the second, a strong intellect. With both Providence had endowed Jackson, and the strong intellect illuminates and explains the page that to others is obscure and meaningless. With its innate faculty for discerning what is essential and for discarding unimportant details, it discovers most valuable lessons where ordinary men see neither light nor leading. Endowed with the power of analysis and assimilation, and accustomed to observe and to reflect upon the relations between cause and effect, it will undoubtedly penetrate far deeper into the actual significance and practical bearing of historical facts than the mental vision, which is less acute. Jackson, by reason of his antecedent training, was eminently capable of the sustained intellectual efforts which strategical conceptions involve. Such was his self-command that under the most adverse conditions, the fatigues and anxieties of a campaign, the fierce excitement of battle, his brain, to use the words of a great Confederate general, worked with the precision of the most perfect machinery. But it was not only in the field, when the necessity for action was pressing, that he was accustomed to seclude himself with his own thoughts. Nor was he content with considering his immediate responsibilities. His interest in the general conduct of the war was of a very thoroughgoing character. While in camp on the Rappahannock, he followed with the closest attention the movements of the armies operating in the valley of the Mississippi, and made himself acquainted, so far as was possible, not only with the local conditions of the war, but also with the character of the Federal leaders. It was said that, in the late spring of 1862, it was the intention of Mr. Davis to transfer him to the command of the Army of the Tennessee, and it is possible that some inkling of this determination induced him to study the Western theatre. Be this as it may, the general situation, military and political, was always in his mind, and despite the victory of Fredericksburg, the future was dark and the indications ominous. According to the official records, the North, at the beginning of April, had more than 900,000 soldiers under arms. The South, so far as can be ascertained, not more than 600,000. The Army of the Potomac was receiving constant reinforcements, and at the beginning of April 130,000 men were encamped on the Stafford Heights. In the west, the whole extent of the Mississippi, with the exception of the 100 miles between Vicksburg and Port Hudson, was held by the Federals, and those important fortresses were both threatened by large armies, acting in concert with a formidable fleet of gunboats. A third army, over 50,000 strong, was posted at Murfreesboro, in the heart of Tennessee, and large detached forces were operating in Louisiana and Arkansas. The inroads of the enemy in the west, greatly aided by the waterways, were in fact far more serious than in the east. But even in Virginia, although the Army of the Potomac had spent nearly 2 years in advancing 50 miles, the Federals had a strong foothold. Winchester had been reoccupied. Fortress Monroe was still garrisoned. Suffolk, on the south bank of the James, 70 miles from Richmond, was held by a force of 20,000 men, while another small army of about the same strength occupied New Bern on the North Carolina coast. Slowly but surely, before the pressure of vastly superior numbers, the frontiers of the Confederacy were contracting, and although in no single direction had a Federal army moved more than a few miles from the river which supplied it, yet the hostile occupation of these rivers, so essential to internal traffic, was making the question of subsistence more difficult every day. Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas, the cattle-raising states, were practically cut off from the remainder, and in a country where railways were few, distances long, and roads indifferent, it was impossible, in default of communication by water, to accumulate and distribute the produce of the farms. Moreover, the dark menace of the blockade had assumed more formidable proportions. The Federal Navy, gradually increasing in numbers and activity, held the highway of the ocean in an iron grip, and proudly, though the Confederacy bore her isolation, men looked across the waters with dread foreboding, for the shadow of their doom was already rising from the pitiless sea. If, then, his staff officers had some reason to complain of their chief's silence and abstraction, it was by no means unfortunate for the South, so imminent was the danger, that the strong brain was incessantly occupied in forecasting the emergencies that might occur. But not for a single moment did Jackson despair of ultimate success. His faith in the justice of the Southern cause was as profound as his trust in God's good providence. He had long since realized that the overwhelming strength of the Federals was more apparent than real. He recognized their difficulties. He knew that the size of an army is limited to the number that can be subsisted, and he relied much on the superior moral and the superior leading of the Confederate troops. After long and mature deliberation, he had come to a conclusion as to the policy to be pursued. "We must make this campaign," he said in a moment of unusual expansion, "an exceedingly active one. Only thus can a weaker country cope with a stronger. It must make up in activity what it lacks in strength. A defensive campaign can only be made successful by taking the aggressive at the proper time. Napoleon never waited for his adversary to become fully prepared, but struck him the first blow." On these principles, Jackson had good reason to believe General Lee had determined to act. Of their efficacy he was convinced, and when his wife came to visit him at the end of April, she found him in good heart and the highest spirits. He not only anticipated a decisive result from the forthcoming operations, but he had seen with peculiar satisfaction that a more manly tone was pervading the Confederate army. Taught by their leaders, by Lee, Jackson, Stuart, and many others, of whose worth and valour they had received convincing proof, the Southern soldiers had begun to practice the clean and wholesome virtue of self-control. They had discovered that purity and temperance are by no means incompatible with military prowess, and that a practical piety, faithful in small things as in great, detracts in no degree from skill and resolution in the field. The Stonewall Brigade set the example. As soon as their own huts were finished, the men, of their own volition, built a log church, where both officers and men, without distinction of rank, were accustomed to assemble during the winter evenings, and those rude walls, illuminated by pine torches cut from the neighbouring forest, witnessed such scenes as filled Jackson's cup of content to overflowing. A chaplain writes, "The devout listener, dressed in simple grey, ornamented only with 3 stars, which any Confederate colonel was entitled to wear, is our great commander, Robert Edward Lee. That dashing-looking cavalryman with fighting jacket, plumed hat, jingling spurs and gay decorations, but solemn, devout aspect during the service, is Jeb Stuart, the flower of cavaliers, and all through the vast crowd wreaths and stars of rank mingle with the bars of the subordinate officers and the rough garb of the private soldier, but perhaps the most supremely happy of the gathered thousands is Stonewall Jackson. One could not," says another, "sit in that pulpit and meet the concentrated gaze of those men without deep emotion. I remembered that they were the veterans of many a bloody field. The eyes which looked into mine, waiting for the gospel of peace, had looked steadfastly upon whatever is terrible in war. Their earnestness of aspect constantly impressed me. They looked as if they had come on business, and very important business, and the preacher could scarcely do otherwise than feel that he too had business of moment there. At this time, largely owing to Jackson's exertions, chaplains were appointed to regiments and brigades, and ministers from all parts of the country were invited to visit the camps. The Chaplains' Association, which did a good work in the army, was established at his suggestion, and although he steadfastly declined to attend its meetings, deeming them outside his functions, nothing was neglected, so far as lay within his power, that might forward the moral welfare of the troops. But at the same time their military efficiency and material comforts received his constant attention. Discipline was made stricter, indolent and careless officers were summarily dismissed, and the divisions were drilled at every favourable opportunity. Headquarters had been transferred to a tent near to Hamilton's Crossing, the general remarking, "It is rather a relief to get where there will be less comfort than in a room, as I hope thereby persons will be prevented from encroaching so much upon my time." On his wife's arrival, he moved to Mr. Yerby's plantation near Hamilton's Crossing, but he did not permit, she writes, the presence of his family to interfere in any way with his military duties. The greater part of each day he spent at his headquarters, but returned as early as he could get off from his labours, and devoted all his leisure time to her visitors, little Julia having his chief attention and his care. His devotion to his child was remarked upon by all who beheld the happy pair together, for she soon learned to delight in his caresses as much as he loved to play with her. An officer's wife, who saw him often during this time, wrote to a friend in Richmond that the general spent all his leisure time in playing with the baby. But these quiet and happy days were soon ended. On April 29th, the roar of cannon was heard once more at Gurney's station, salvo after salvo following in quick succession, until the house shook and the windows rattled with the reverberations. The crash of musketry succeeded, rapid and continuous, and before the sun was high, wounded men were brought into the shelter of Mr. Yerby's outhouses. Very early in the morning a message from the pickets had come in, and after making arrangements for his wife and child to leave at once for Richmond, the general, without waiting for breakfast, had hastened to the front. The Federals were crossing the Rappahannock, and Stonewall Jackson had gone to his last field. Chapter 23. Chancellorsville. It has already been said that while the Army of Northern Virginia lay in winter quarters, the omens did not point to decisive success in the forthcoming campaign. During the same period that Lincoln and Stanton, taught by successive disasters, had ceased to interfere with their generals, Jefferson Davis and Mr. Seddon, his new Secretary of War, had taken into their own hands the complete control of military operations. The results appeared in the usual form. On the northern side, unity of purpose and concentration. On the southern, uncertainty of aim and dispersion. In the west, the Confederate generals were fatally hampered by the orders of the President. In the east, the Army of Northern Virginia, confronted by a mass of more than 130,000 foes, was deprived of 3 of Longstreet's divisions, and when, at the end of April, it was reported that Hooker was advancing, it was absolutely impossible that this important detachment could rejoin in time to assist in the defence of the Rappahannock. A full discussion of the Chancellorsville campaign does not fall within the scope of this biography, but in justice to the Southern generals, to Lee, who resolved to stand his ground, and to Jackson, who approved the resolution, it must be explained that they were in no way responsible for the absence of 20,000 veterans. Undoubtedly, the situation on the Atlantic littoral was sufficiently embarrassing to the Confederate authorities. The presence of a Federal force at New Bern in North Carolina threatened the main line of railway by which Wilmington and Charleston communicated with Richmond, and these 2 ports were of the utmost importance to the Confederacy. So enormous were the profits arising from the exchange of munitions of war and medicines for cotton and tobacco that English shipowners embarked eagerly on a lucrative if precarious traffic. Blockade running became a recognized business. Companies were organized which possessed large fleets of swift steamers. The Bahamas and Bermuda became vast entrepôts of trade. English seamen were not to be deterred from a perilous enterprise by fear of northern broadsides or northern prisons, and despite the number and activity of the blockading squadrons, the cordon of cruisers and gunboats was constantly broken. Many vessels were sunk, many captured, many wrecked on a treacherous coast, and yet enormous quantities of supplies found their way to the arsenals and magazines of Richmond and Atlanta. The railways, then, leading from Wilmington and Charleston, the ports most accessible to the blockade runners, were almost essential to the existence of the Confederacy. Soon after the Battle of Fredericksburg, General D. H. Hill was placed in command of the forces which protected them, and, at the beginning of the new year, Ransom's division was drawn from the Rappahannock to reinforce the local levies. A few weeks later, General Lee was induced by Mr. Seddon to send Longstreet, with the divisions of Hood and Pickett, to cover Richmond, which was menaced both from Fortress Monroe and Suffolk. The commander-in-chief, however, while submitting to this detachment as a necessary evil, had warned General Longstreet so to dispose his troops that they could return to the Rappahannock at the first alarm. The enemy's position, he wrote, on the sea-coast had been probably occupied merely for purposes of defence. It was likely that they were strongly entrenched, and nothing would be gained by attacking them. The warning, however, was disregarded, and that Mr. Seddon should have yielded in the first instance to the influence of the sea power, exciting apprehensions of sudden attack along the whole seaboard of the Confederacy, may be forgiven him. Important lines of communication were certainly exposed. But when, in defiance of Lee's advice that the divisions should be retained within easy reach of Fredericksburg, he suggested to Longstreet the feasibility of an attack on Suffolk, 120 miles distant from the Rappahannock, he committed an unpardonable blunder. Had Jackson been in Longstreet's place, the Secretary's proposal, however promising of personal renown, would unquestionably have been rejected. The leader who had kept the main object so steadfastly in view throughout the Valley campaign would never have overlooked the expressed wishes of the commander-in-chief. Longstreet, however, brilliant fighting soldier as he was, appears to have misconceived the duties of a detached force. He was already prejudiced in favour of a movement against Suffolk. Before he left for his new command, he had suggested to Lee that one army corps only should remain on the Rappahannock, while the other operated south of Richmond. And soon after his arrival, he urged upon his superior that, in case Hooker moved, the Army of Northern Virginia should retire to the North Anna. In short, to his mind, the operations of the main body should be made subservient to those of the detached force. Lee, with 30,000 men, holding Hooker's 130,000 in check until Longstreet had won his victory and could march north to join him. Such strategy was not likely to find favour at headquarters. It was abundantly evident, in the first place, that the Army of Northern Virginia must be the principal objective of the Federals, and in the second place, that the defeat of the force of Suffolk, if it were practicable, would have no effect whatever upon Hooker's action, except insomuch that his knowledge of Longstreet's absence might quicken his resolution to advance. Had Suffolk been a point vital to the north, the question would have assumed a different shape. As it was, the town merely covered a tract of conquered territory, the Norfolk dockyard and the mouth of the James River. The Confederates would gain little by its capture. The Federals would hardly feel its loss. It was most improbable that a single man of Hooker's army would be detached to defend a point of such comparative insignificance, and it was quite possible that Longstreet would be unable to get back in time to meet him, even on the North Anna. General Lee, however, anxious as ever to defer to the opinions of the man on the spot, as well as to meet the wishes of the government, yielded to Longstreet's insistence that a fine opportunity for an effective blow presented itself, and in the first week of April the latter marched against Suffolk.